Thank you, Dr. Curry. I sat here and I looked at one of my colleagues, and earlier he was weeping, and he took out his tissue. And at one moment, I wanted to weep, but then I said, no, I'm going to change my lens on my glass. Click, click. The next speaker is Dr. Norm White. He's the Associate Dean for Community and Engagement and Associate Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at St. Louis University. In addition to his academic work, he is the principal investigator for Shut It Down. It's closed in the School of Prison Pipeline Project in St. Louis. Does everybody know what the school, prison, pipeline to prison, from school to prison? Everybody familiar with that? I'm a retired teacher, school administrator, so I saw it in full force. He also works with student volunteers in the Overground Railroad for Literacy, a tutorial program and local after-school programs to improve student academic performance. At this time, Dr. Norm White.
Good afternoon. I don't know if this thing's working. They moved. This is amazing to stand. When I was sitting up here, I was thinking about how amazing this is. And if you could sit up there and look at this picture, you'd understand. I sing in a choir, a community gospel choir that tries to work around issues of race in the St. Louis area. And when we sing, often it's very integrated groups. But you don't see that in church usually. What you usually see is one or the other, but not both. And often when you see both, it's, we have that divide thing going on. I'm not a very religious man, in case you were sitting out here when we were sitting in the back talking to each other earlier. But I am just I've been so taken by a spiritual life that guides me. I was asked 2 years ago to talk at the first one of these sacred conversations, and I thought it was an honor. And I was asked by somebody who I felt I needed to stand with. When I was a kid, when I was very young, I feel like I got chased out of the church. Maybe I just was getting ready to run anyway, but I was raised a Catholic, and I found out that those who call themselves priests are just men. And in the 60s when I was a kid, or 50s and 60s when I was a kid, we were going through a lot of turmoil. And I experienced what I felt was clear racism, and I couldn't understand how that man who had stood in front of us on Sunday mornings to talk about the Bible and the Gospels and how we should live together and how we should be, could stand there and do what he had done, what he had said to me. And I decided that church was not the place for me to be. It took me a long time to find my way back to a spiritual life that helps me to go each and every day. But in the last couple of years, on August 9th of 2014, life changed in this community. And what I began to see was ministers who actually had read the gospel, but more importantly, they were living by that gospel. That they were out in the streets, they were standing with young people who were hurting and who were in pain, and they were present for them. So I know that I don't have a lot of time because we're running behind, but I will talk briefly, on one of those things. The first time I gave the talk, I called it the roots of their bitterness. And the reason I called it that was because I had been doing some interviews with some guys, and they had taught this. One of the guys had said to me, You know, you understand the roots of our bitterness. You understand why we're so angry. That our anger comes from people looking at us the way they do, treating us the way they do, the conditions that we live through each and every day, and you get it. And your job is to kind of share that with people. So I named the talk after him. And I had been asked in that talk to do a timeline that kind of went through history and made important points in time that had effects on how African American life had been affected in the St. Louis area. I decided I needed to change that talk, and the last time I did the talk, it was kind of this one, that in the light of Michael Brown, that there is something different that has happened. At one point I had said it was in the darkness, but I think it's in the light, because his light has led us to do some things that are very powerful. His light has put us in these pews here today. Because without his light, we wouldn't have been having these sacred conversations, because the people who decided to have them would not have been down that path. We wouldn't have been in a place to think about it in that way. So I'd like to start, I had been asked to do, and this is going to be very brief, but I was born in 1953. Really significant time in this country. I think of it as the opening of America's second moral moment. The first moral moment was what we call the Civil War. It began prior to 1860, but then after, when 1860 came, all broke loose, and we went somewhere else. In 1953, when I was born, the following year, this powerful thing happened. The United States Supreme Court said, "Are you kidding? Separate but equal, and you think that we really believe that that is true?" And the country went on a journey into a civil rights movement. We began to do some things that were a little bit different, or we were pretending to do that, I think. But I wouldn't be standing here before you today without that second moral moment. I was what I often introduce myself as Norm from the projects. I was a kid who was raised by two parents who had dropped out of high school. Chances of me going to college were slim and none, given where they had come from, because they saw my future in a civil service job or something like that. That was where I was heading. But because of that second moral moment, college became real for me. And I got an opportunity to further my education and to get a degree. So I wouldn't be standing here without that time in our lives. But I also realized that it's really hard for me to only talk about how good things had gotten and how far we've come. Because I'm a criminologist. I study crime, I study violence, I study the pain of people's lives. And the reality is that there is a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of pain present always, each and every day. The Maasai in Africa greet each other and they say to each other, "How are the children?" They don't say hello, they don't say, "What's up?" They say, "How are the children?" And the answer to that question when you're asked, "How are the children?" should be, "The children are fine, they're okay." I don't know that the children are okay. And I don't think that they're okay because of conditions that have been allowed to exist in the way they've festered in this country for so long. So I have to talk about some other things. So the first talk was this one. It actually had this continuum, and it went from the beginning, 1619, when the first of us arrived here, and the patterns of that. And I talked about some legislation in the Board of Aldermen in St. Louis that contributed to what they called kind of an abandonment of North St. Louis, even though they said that they weren't doing that. You know, so we're not really going to ignore the fact that that part of town exists as it is, but we're going to stop investing in it. We're going to allow it to kind of fall into decay. Oh no, we didn't do that. The problem is that most people don't drive through there, so you don't know whether they did it or not. I drive through there a lot. But what I really had gotten to was this place down here, that this is more where I am at this point, from the summer of 2014 and beyond. I think that that has become important for me. And what I look at as other moments in time. And beginning in August of 2014, we began to see this pattern. So first, Michael Brown lays in the street for 4 hours and some minutes. And then we have Eric Garner, who gets kind of snuffed out, or actually he was first, snuffed out for selling cigarettes in front of a store in New York City. Von Derek Myers gets shot in St. Louis. Freddie Gray gets his spine broken in Baltimore. Sandra Bland hangs herself in a jail cell in Texas. The pain of those things mattered. I put their names up because in the last 2 years, one of the things that the young people made clear is that we need to say their names. Their names are important because they are markers for where we are going and where we need to get to. Southern trees, they bear a strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral sound of the gallant South. The bulging eyes, the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is that strange and bitter crop. I have a hard time singing that song, but I think it's important that it be a part of the conversations about race. That the pain that was felt on August 9th as that young man laid in that street felt as though he was hanging from a tree in the community he came from. That it was reminiscent of that. And then one by one, the bodies added up. To the point where in 2014, I was trying to get all the ones who had been killed by police that didn't have guns, and I couldn't fit them all on a slide. There were another 28 that would have fit on here. And that was in 2014. The challenge we're confronted with is that until that kind of thing stops, until that pain goes away, until people realize that we care that those young people are dying like that. And it's not whether or not they did something bad. Police aren't the executioner. They're not the judge and the jury. It's okay that people get arrested. I've interviewed guys who've done dirt in their life. I worked for 15 years at institutions with guys who did dirt in their life. They know that one of the consequences is that you may go to jail. They don't think one of the consequences is that you'll lay dead in the street because of what you did that may not be that significant, selling cigarettes, selling CDs. I think that's what Freddie Gray was accused of. So my question in my mind as I was thinking about today was, when have Black lives mattered in this country? And there's a whole series of events. In 1863, there was an Emancipation Proclamation. It said, you all are free. You can move on with your lives. But were they free? And then in 1865, the 13th Amendment gave them citizenship. And then Brown versus Board of Education. And then the voting rights and employment and housing acts and the voting rights things that took away literacy tests and all those kinds of events that took place in this country. Did they truly make Black lives matter, or were they making us feel like we had done something that made us feel good? And I think there's no truer words than these by Martin Luther King. That morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. And that judicial decrees may not change the heart, but they can restrain the heartless. The scary thing in my mind right now is I'm not sure that even's true. In the last year and a half, as we've gone through this election cycle, and we see where we've gotten to and what's going on in this moment in time, the question becomes, who's going to stand? Who are the people who are going to stand against this thing? And call it for what it is, if it truly needs to be called. That, in my mind, is a powerful moment for us. And I believe very strongly that when you have the intersection of race and poverty, it's a dangerous intersection indeed. So when I talk about not needing to talk about what I see, it's because it's created lots of heartache and a lot of harm in this society. When I first started being out in the community and doing these talks, I remember in 2005 when Katrina happened and CNN turned on and they were talking about, they look like refugees. What's going on? I don't understand. Who are these people? Who are these people? Not in America. But all the faces look like the faces in those pictures that I'm showing you up there. And after the storm left, that's what it looked like down in New Orleans. That's what it looked like down there. I'm not even sure that they fixed it yet, but not in that part of town. But what's even more troubling to me are these next pictures. I do work in the city of St. Louis, and I travel around and I go into different neighborhoods. And I started taking pictures as I started doing that work. And the pictures that I'm showing you are pictures of streets in St. Louis. There's tons of them that I could find for you, where houses are falling down around people. They're boarded up if they're lucky. They are dangerous. They are public health hazards. And the city says they can't take them down because it costs too much. It costs too much not to take them down because it hurts the soul, it hurts the heart in ways that are not, that shouldn't be. But we don't have to go across the river. This is down the block from here, I guess. You know, if you go through East St. Louis, you have the same exact kind of patterns of buildings falling down, disinvestment, urban abandonment. So the question I ask, and kind of picking up where my friend the minister said, when do Black Lives Matter and how? Because This has been going on for a long time. It didn't get like that overnight. I see it as an immorality, and I'm actually really troubled because I work on a college campus where we just got the city to blight an area so we can do investment there. I'm really troubled by that. Because when you blight an area, you're not blighting just the buildings, you're blighting the people. That's an important thing, that you're blighting the people there because you stop doing anything there while you allow it to fall down around their ears. Two sociologists, Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, have called this in a form of American apartheid. That essentially we have created this system of townships across this country where people struggle each and every day, and the behavior of us as a society has been just as bad as it was in South Africa, if not worse, because we pretend it's not what it is. We pretend that. In Cape Town and in the different parts of South Africa, you had to show passes to go from place to place. In the United States, you just have to get stopped and frisked. It's just a pedestrian stop. How many of your children, how many of you think your child would get stopped for walking in the middle of the street by the police and wind up dead? That was Michael Brown's crime that day. That police officer did not know he had gotten that the other event had happened. And they said that very early on. Apartheid was a terrible thing there, and it's a terrible thing here. We are at the place where we have to dismantle that because all of our lives get better when we stop allowing that to exist. Because that condition, it only does what it does. The outcomes are expectable. All right. I'm not going to make you look at numbers because I think I'm running out of time anyway. But the problem of it is really significant. You know, when you segregate and you limit the 90 seconds. Okay, 90 seconds. This is going to be really quick. Watch these. My work talks about what I call risk immersion. That these communities that are in those conditions, people are immersed in risk. They're not at risk, they are living in it, and you can't get away from it. The young people that I know struggle against it all the time because even when they're trying to do right, it's hard to do what's right and stay out of trouble. It's hard to stay away from the police officer that's going to stop you for walking down the middle of the street. But the problem is that it's been like this for years. This is 1841 in England, where they were looking at density of population, economic conditions, you know, how much wealth was in an area. This was crime in those areas, and I'm sorry because I'm rushing at this point, but that the places where had the highest poverty had the same problems of crime, right? 1841. In France, this was in the 1890s, that W.E.B. Du Bois did the same study in Philadelphia and found the same thing. In the place where people were struggling the most against life, crime happens. Social problems exist. This is in the middle of the 1940s, 50s, where these two sociologists from the University of Chicago determined that there were natural areas of crime, and they were the places that were slums of Chicago because of the conditions that existed there. What was interesting, though, is that when they were doing the studies, the people that were there were Irish, Italian, German. They were from Eastern Europe. And when they were living in those conditions, their crime rates were high. They were having trouble. And when they moved out of those places, crime rates went down for the population, literacy improved, so they did better in school. The social problems seemed to kind of disappear. Not knowing I think that the problem that we're confronted with is that there's an immorality of not paying attention to this stuff, but when you know about it and don't do anything about it, that's a problem. That's what I do at school, in my school. I make my students have to become aware of the reality, and once you know, it's hard to walk away from that. That's a challenge. I'm not going to sing again, but I do believe that I'm a dreamer. People think that I'm kind of a dreamer. I think about all these wonderful things that can be. That there's possibilities in this life if we allow this life to be. I think that there's possibilities looking out in this group of people today because of what I see in this room. That the possibility is that people who hardly ever get a chance to just simply sit and talk to each other will talk to each other and get different kind of understandings. And even more importantly, when you walk away from here, you may walk back into each other's lives and have another conversation that moves to something more. That's a powerful thing, and it's something that we as a nation need. That we live in divergent social worlds. Our worlds are so separate that we never talk to each other. We don't understand each other. And then when we are confronted with each other, it's like all lives matter, Black lives matter, blue lives matter. You all are the possibility. And I appreciate being here. I'm not going to take up your time because the important work is about to happen in this room. So thanks for your moment, the time that you've given me, and